You've asked it before, usually late, in the specific dark, where the ceiling has no opinion on the matter. What's the point? Not dramatically. Quietly, almost bored, the way you'd check a phone with no notifications. You go to work, you come home, you scroll, you sleep, and somewhere inside that loop the question resurfaces, uninvited, and you wait for an answer that never fully arrives. Lately you've started to suspect the question itself might be broken. You just don't know what to do with that suspicion, or who to say it to without sounding ungrateful for a life that, by most measures, is fine. In 1849, a Danish philosopher named Søren Kierkegaard published a short, strange book under a pseudonym because he suspected no one would take the argument seriously coming from a known name. The book was called The Sickness Unto Death, and its central claim sounds almost too simple to matter. Despair is not sadness. Despair, he wrote, is the specific condition of a self that will not, or cannot, become itself. He wasn't describing a mood. He was describing a mismatch between what a life is doing day to day and what that life is actually for. And here's the part that should unsettle you. Kierkegaard noticed that the people most consumed by this despair weren't always the ones in visible crisis. Some of them had jobs that worked, families that loved them, routines that held together perfectly on paper. Underneath, a low static hum they couldn't name, because nothing was technically wrong. If ordinary misery needs a reason, and despair apparently doesn't, then what is the point actually asking for when you demand one? Kierkegaard had a name for the quietest version of this condition, the despair of not even being conscious of having a self to lose, and in his account, that quiet version was worse than the loud one, because at least the loud one knows there's something to repair. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because you recognize the hum, not the crisis. The hum, the version of Tuesday where nothing is wrong and nothing feels like enough, either. You've built a life that mostly works, and there's still this quiet drag underneath it, present in the smallest moments. Brushing your teeth, waiting on the coffee, refreshing something you've already refreshed twice. You start to suspect the problem is you specifically, that you're missing some gratitude or ambition or faith that other people seem to have figured out, so you try to outproduce the feeling. Another goal. A side project. A book that promises the answer by chapter 6. For a while, it works, or looks like it's working. You keep the calendar full on purpose, because a full calendar doesn't leave room for the question to surface, and for a stretch that almost passes for a solution. Then the hum comes back anyway, patient, waiting for you in traffic, or right after finishing the thing you were sure would finally be enough. Here's the part nobody says out loud. The hum isn't a sign something is wrong with you. But you can't know that yet, so you carry it like evidence of a private failure, telling no one, because there's nothing external to point to. No breakup, no diagnosis. Just a quiet erosion where meaning is supposed to live, and a growing unspoken fear that maybe there isn't one, and you've simply been lucky enough, so far, not to notice. Nearly a century after Kierkegaard, an Austrian psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was deported first to Theresienstadt and later to Auschwitz and a Kaufering subcamp near Munich. Before the war, he had already developed a theory that broke from his own teachers, that the primary drive in a human being wasn't pleasure, as Freud had argued, and wasn't power, as Adler had argued, but meaning. The camps became, in the most brutal way a theory has ever been tested, a proving ground for that idea. Frankl noticed something the guards never intended to teach anyone. Prisoners who held onto one specific, concrete reason to endure, a manuscript they wanted to finish, a spouse they pictured seeing again, a single task they quietly assigned themselves each day, outlasted those who couldn't locate a reason, even when the physical conditions were identical. He later wrote about a man he counseled who survived one particular winter by picturing his wife's face in the doorway of a windowless room. It didn't remove the suffering, it gave the suffering a direction to point in. Frankl eventually called this approach logotherapy, built around what he named the will to meaning, and its central move was strangely narrow for something built inside a death camp. He stopped asking people what they wanted from life, and started asking what life, in this specific hour, was asking of them. He later described suffering, guilt, and death as a tragic triad no life fully escapes, and his argument wasn't that meaning cancels the triad out. It was that meaning is the only thing capable of standing next to it without collapsing. That reversal is the whole argument, and it cuts against everything. The question "what's the point?" assumes. That question expects life to owe you an answer, delivered once, in advance, like a syllabus handed out on the first day. Frankl's version has no syllabus. It has a question mark pointed back at you, in this exact circumstance, asking what you intend to do with it. The camps didn't hand Frankl an answer to distribute to the rest of us. They handed him a method for generating one, repeatedly, in conditions where every abstract answer would have collapsed the moment it touched the ground. So the hum you feel on an ordinary Tuesday, and the despair Frankl watched in a windowless room, aren't different problems at different scales. They're the same misfired question, asked at different volumes. You've been treating meaning like a verdict a court hands down, final and external, waiting somewhere out past your control. But it was never going to arrive that way. Not because you're asking it wrong, but because it isn't that kind of thing to begin with. It isn't a fact you uncover once and keep. It's a response you generate, situation by situation, the way a musician doesn't wait for a blank page to hand over a melody. They sit down, and they play, and the melody exists because they made the decision to keep going past the first wrong note. The point was never something sitting out there in advance, waiting to be found. It was always a stance you take toward whatever happens to be in front of you today, whether or not it looks meaningful from the outside. Which means the question you've been asking has no correct answer, not because life is empty, but because it's the wrong kind of question for the thing you're actually looking for. I noticed this shift in something small, almost embarrassingly small. For a long time I treated my own work like it had to justify itself, like unless it added up to something obviously significant, none of it counted. That's a heavier weight than it sounds like. Asking every ordinary hour to prove its cosmic worth before you're allowed to feel good about spending it. What actually changed wasn't the work, it was the question sitting underneath it. Instead of asking whether this hour mattered in some grand final accounting, I started asking what this hour was actually asking of me. Attention, honesty, showing up anyway, even unimpressively. Some days the answer is small. Fix what's broken. Call the person you've been avoiding. Finish the page you keep rewriting the first line of. I won't pretend the hum disappeared for good either. It still shows up, usually on the days I've let the calendar do the avoiding for me again. None of this resolves into a tidy philosophy you repeat at dinner. It's closer to a discipline than a belief, because you don't arrive at meaning and get to stay there. You keep re-answering the question every time it goes quiet again, which it will, probably by next Tuesday. That's not a flaw in the method. Frankl didn't survive by finding meaning once and holding it. He kept finding it, hour by hour, because the alternative was a despair he'd already watched consume the man standing next to him. So the next time the question surfaces, at 2 a.m., or in traffic, or in the middle of something that should feel like enough and doesn't, try not answering it the old way. Don't ask what the point of your life is. Ask what this specific hour is asking of you, and do that thing, badly if you have to, but do it. Frankl, quoting Nietzsche, put it more plainly than any of us could. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Maybe the why was never going to arrive fully formed, wrapped, and waiting. Maybe it only shows up the way footprints do, visible only after you've already started walking, and not one step before.